All right, so let's implement a simple React counter, which is simple enough that but it has an actual minimal value and something that's easy to capture. So let's implement a counter component that has a current value, and it has two buttons: one to increment the counter and one to decrement the counter. Okay. Again, typically this would be a self-contained, stateful component where the counter maintains its own count, right? It doesn't have to notify anybody. But if it needed to notify it, it would have to go back and forth, which we want to avoid. So let's implement a counter. Let's see. Grab that. And let's here go in a component here, and let's say let's new file, and we'll say this is a counter component. Okay, let's see. So we need a counter component, and we'll say here that this is import React from React. Okay, and it has a value of 0 in ES6. You can provide default values for attributes, so that if you don't have a particular value, you can give it a default value. These buttons will probably be linked to some on-click, yes, that will invoke some event handlers that are being passed to it. Okay, right now it's not. Okay, so let's see if we can render that index. So in that index, let's see. Let's just render that for now. Let's render here the oh, I don't have it. Do I have to export it? Oh, I need to export it. Let's export this. So this is export default counter component, and here we can say counter component. There we go. Okay. So if we render that, there's our counter. There's 0, plus, and minus. Trivial. Okay. All right. So how do we go about this? Let me close that. Okay, we rendered it. All right, so let's add two buttons. Right, the buttons will be so that we can click these. So let's oops, copy, and let's go into the counter, and let's replace these two buttons, so that if we click on one, it alerts and says plus. Minus, it says minus. Right, so that's also easy enough, right? We have a button on click, and it has an event, and then the implementation of that, the body of that, is to alert plus or alert minus. Okay? Right? Easy enough. All right, so instead of doing that, what I'd like to be able to do is to notify some reducer, meaning I don't handle this. Somebody's going to do this, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to replace this by calling plus and minus. So this is going to call plus, and this is going to call minus. That's being passed to us, and somehow that's going to go out to the reducer. It's going to change our value, and it's going to be fed to us again. Okay? All right. Excellent. So let's build. Who handles that? That's going to be handled by the container, right? So let's create a container. Let's create here a counter container. So this is going to be a counter container. Oops. What? Oh, directory. Sorry. This will be counter container. All right. So this will be what? This will be import React from React, And we'll also need what? We'll need the connect, right? We'll need the connect. So this will be import connect. And this is from React Redux. We'll need the counter itself, right? So let's import the counter. So the counter component from, let's go up, and then down to the component, and let's bring the counter component. There it is. We'll need a mapper. We'll need a mapper from the state, right? So let's see. We'll do a const state to property mapper, and this will be the state. And we're going to grab from here. We're going to grab that the value of the counter, this value, we're going to grab it from the state that the reducer is going to generate. So state dot counter value. Notice that I am deliberately calling these different, value and counter value, right? Because they don't have to be the same, right? Okay, so let's not make that error. It doesn't have to be the same. And then we'll do the connection. We'll say const. This will be counter container. Container will be the connect of the state property mapper applied to the counter component. There we go. Right. So that's the counter container, and we're going to export it. Export the to the default, the counter container. Okay? All right, so this is exactly the same thing that we did earlier. Yes? Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yep. All right. So this is exactly the same thing we did earlier, right? And these look identical logically. Let's create a reducer. The reducer, we'll say that this is counter.js. And this will be a simple function. That's also the beauty here, right? That these are all functions, right? That they can all be tested independently of each other, right? There's very little dependency between them, right? They don't have to remember anything. These are just plain old functions. So this is counter, and this is right now. Let's return something static. Let's return that the counter value is 10. Okay, that's the current state. That's the current state of the application, is that the counter value is 10. Presumably, this will be mapped to the counter property. I'm sorry, the value property of the counter component. Yes? Let's export this. Export to default and counter. Counter. Now we have to do the glue between these, right? So let's go back to the index. Let's grab. We're going to create a store from the new reducer we just created, the counter reducer, from reducers counter. We'll need the container, the counter container from containers, counter containers, because we're going to render the counter container. Yes, but the counter container has nothing to render. It needs to be fed, provided a store. Right, so we're not going to use the hello store. We're going to create a brand new store for the counter. So this will be const. The store will be create store from the counter reducer. And we're going to provide it to the counter container. So provider store provided to the counter container. All right. Let's see what we broke. Notice that it's 10. Right. Already, right, the provider store is providing the state that is being fed to the component's property value, right? If we change the state of the counter to be 12, right? It's fed to be 12. Everybody okay? All right. So let's see how adding plus or minus causes us to change the state, or I'm sorry, not change, generate the new state. Right, so let's do that. Right, in the component, we're going to call a plus, right? Which are over here. These are the properties. These are the properties we're going to need to map these properties to dispatchers. Right, so let's do that. Let's do that in the container. The container is going to create a mapper, an action to property mapper that takes in a dispatch function that is going to return a map that tells me what does the property plus is going to map to, right? And what is the minus property going to map to? Okay. So what should these map to? It's going to be just a dispatch. It's going to generate an action object that's going to have to provide at least the type that might be something like plus. Right? It's going to tell the reducer, this is what happened. The action was that there was a plus event. And the reducer is going to have to generate a new state whose counter value needs to be whatever it used to be plus 1. Right? Whereas over here, the dispatch will be that it will generate an action that will take the reducer that there was a minus event. Okay? So that means that the counter reducer can't just generate this static JSON object as a state. Instead, it needs to look at the current state and needs to look at the action of what happened. Okay? Right? So now no longer is this just a hard-coded thing, right? It's a function, an actual function, which is going to look at the different things that could happen in the action, depending on the type, right? That if it was plus, right? If it was plus, then it's going to return, right? The counter value. Counter value, right? So yeah, counter value. Is that what it's called? I forget. It was, right? So the counter value should be what? Should be whatever the counter value used to be. Where is that? It's in the current state. The current state has it, right? So it should be, it should be whatever the state used to be, which presumably the counter value should be in there, counter value, right, plus 1. Right? If instead, if it was minus, then the new counter value is whatever the previous state's counter value was, minus 1. And the default should be that it returns that the counter value is, 10. Right? Right. So we start at 10, and this doesn't work. Uh-oh. Plus is not a function. Where is that? Counter container plus dispatch.
You don't pass that mapper to the connect.
Ooh, thank you. Yes, right here. This needs to be connected right here. There we go. Right. So this goes plus or minus and change the state. Again, the counter itself has no idea of the state. It's not handling itself. All this is being delegated to the reducer. The reducer is the sole owner of the state, right? And it's available, made available throughout through the provider, right? And then mapped to each one of the components through the containers. Make sense? All right. Let's take a short break, and then we'll come back right after this.